Hello and welcome to the National Book Festival. My name is Marie Arana and I'm the Literary Director of the Library of Congress. I'm here with David Rubenstein, whose featured book at the festival is How to Lead: Wisdom from the World's Greatest CEOs, Founders, and Game Changers. But David, apart from being a successful author, is also the co-founder of the Carlyle Group, which is one of the world's largest and most successful private equity firms. He's also the co-chairman of this festival. Welcome, David. So wonderful to have you here.
Thank you very much, Marie, for having me, and thank you for organizing the National Book Festival and doing such a wonderful job in making certain that it worked virtually this year.
Well, thank you so much for that. Really appreciate that comment. If you'd like to see David's presentation, it's a wonderful presentation with Andrea Mitchell, who is a friend of yours, right, David?
Correct.
Yep, and you can see it at loc.gov/bookfest, and it's a marvelous presentation. So good to have you here. My first question to you, David, is, the American Story, which was your last book, American Story, a conversation with the master historians, is so linked in a way to How to Lead, because it talks about leadership. It talks about the history of this country and who made our great leaders. And then you go on to write this other book about, well, let's look at the rest of the world and who makes great CEOs and who makes great game changers in the world. So one naturally leads to another, obviously. And how did that happen for you?
Well, the first book was about interviews I had conducted of great historians at the Library of Congress at a program we call the Congressional Dialogues, where members of Congress come and they listen to an interview that I conduct of a great historian like Doris Kearns Goodwin or let's say David McCullough or someone like that. And it seemed to be pretty popular. And so I took some of those interviews and put them in the book. Now, the interviews were not with Thomas Jefferson or George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, but it was with people who knew a lot about them. Interestingly, the interview concept is relatively new. I can trace it back maybe as entertainment to the Tonight Show in the 1950s, when Steve Allen was interviewing people about news, but entertainment and so forth. And the interview format took off. And as we now know, every TV show seems to be an interview show to some extent. But we don't have interviews of Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. They weren't interviewed in that concept in that way. So in effect, the only way to get an interview with them is really with the historians that knew them. The new book is really a book about the current leaders of our country in different areas. So it's not the old leaders, but the current leaders, from Bill Gates to Jeff Bezos to Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Yo-Yo Ma, people like that, extraordinary people in different areas. And so I interviewed them over a course of several years, and I distilled them down. And then I tried to summarize what I thought leadership was all about and why leadership is important. And I did that at the beginning of the book and gave my own perceptions of the importance of leadership and what it really means.
Well, over the years, you've become this extraordinary interviewer yourself, David. You've interviewed on PBS shows, on Bloomberg and Congressional Dialogues and the Library of Congress. In this festival, you've interviewed a great deal for us. And so when did you decide that you were going to go from private equity to interviews of important, famous people that would educate us?
Like most things that happen to people in life that are good, it happens by serendipity. People don't sit down and say, I'm going to build a great company like Apple or build a great company like Microsoft, and it just happens the way you anticipate it. So what actually happened was I became the president of the Economic Club of Washington about a dozen years ago. I was supposed to get business people to speak, and I realized pretty quickly that they might be great business people. They weren't great speakers. So I thought I could liven it up by interviewing them, and people seemed to like the way I was doing it. And ultimately Bloomberg came along and said, why don't I do it on television? Then PBS picked it up. And so I've been doing it for a while, and I enjoy it. I enjoy reading books. I enjoy meeting people, asking questions. There's an old Yiddish word for this called yenta, which means you want to know everything. And so my mother would say, I'm really a yenta, but I actually enjoy getting to find out what makes people tick. And so my pleasure in kind of learning these things is really maybe coming out in the interview process.
Well, curiosity serves you well. David. And we have a bunch of questions here, obviously, for you, lining up very quickly. So let me start with Lisa Finkelstein, who says, love your historian and leader interviews on PBS and Bloomberg. Has there been anyone you invited to interview who turned you down? And whom would you like to interview that you have not?
Well, on the latter question, of course, I would like to interview people that are hard to get to interview. Queen Elizabeth doesn't do interviews. Xi Jinping is not giving a lot of interviews to people like me, probably. I would say I'd like to interview the Pope, but he doesn't do a lot of interviews with me either, people like me. So there are some people, but I would say I've gotten to interview a lot of really great people. The people that I think would be the most interesting to interview would be people who are no longer alive. Now, we have no way of doing that, but as I said, the interview process is a relatively new one, so there are no interview transcripts of people, but I'd love to interview people like Abraham Lincoln and say, did you win the Civil War all by yourself, or did you actually help other people do it? And I think he would probably say, no, I had a lot of people. He's a fairly modest guy. Or ask Henry VIII, why didn't you use prenuptial agreements as opposed to having to chop off the heads of your wives when you were getting rid of them? Or ask Cleopatra, who was a better lover, Mark Antony or Julius Caesar? Those are the things I'd like to know. Or William Shakespeare, ask him, who really wrote those plays for you? How come you got all the credit for that? Who really did those plays? So I'm never going to get a chance to find those answers out. But maybe if someday I get to heaven, I can go to ask those people, because presumably they're there, and maybe I can do interviews in heaven. Who knows?
David, I think you've got the subject for a new book right there. No doubt. Cynthia Lewis wants to know, what books are currently on your nightstand, and are there fiction? Is there any fiction there, or nonfiction?
I am a big reader of nonfiction. I read a lot of books a year, almost 100 books, but that's because I'm reading books on things I know something about, biographies and history, business, philanthropy, politics. Those are subjects I know reasonably well. The newest book I have is the new book that's been written by a professor at Harvard, at the Kennedy School at Harvard, on John Kennedy, his first, I think it's up to 1956. And it's a new book out on John Kennedy. I've just finished reading the book on Jim Baker by Peter Baker and Susan Glasser, his wife. And I'm going to interview them shortly for a book party. And then the other book I've just finished reading is the new book by Jonathan Alter on Jimmy Carter, my former boss. So those books are ones that I've just finished reading, or just about finished reading in case of most of them. And they were great books.
And they're all books you're going to be working with. How about just books for pleasure?
Well, everything I read is for pleasure, because I don't read anything that's not for pleasure. I love what I'm reading. So I must confess, I'm not a gigantic novel reader, but I did interview John Grisham for a matter recently, and he just sent me his latest novel. So I guess I'm, as a lawyer, and it's about a legal matter, I guess I will read it. But generally, I tend to read nonfiction. But that's a real. We all have our character flaws, and one of my character flaws is I tend to read nonfiction more than fiction.
Well, you're going to like that Grisham novel, because we're featuring it at this festival, and it's pretty full of stuff that might interest you, David. Really, really good stuff. Denise Lauda has an interesting question for you. She says, "Do you see any value in studying bad leadership?"
Absolutely, because you don't know what good leadership is until you see bad leadership. So it's a complicated thing. I didn't really want to go out and interview bad leaders and say, it's hard to get interviews with people saying, look, I'm going to do a book on bad leadership, so can I interview you? So it's hard to get those kind of people to agree. So what I try to do is write about good leaders. And if you read in between the lines, you can get the picture about who I think are not great leaders, or the qualities I don't really value. So, for example, in my book, I do talk about the qualities I think are very important. I list about a dozen of them. Luck at the very beginning, of course, is essential to be a good leader. But one of the qualities I admire is humility. And I do think that great leaders are pretty humble. Now, if you talk to Warren Buffett, he doesn't brag about things. I can't imagine Abraham Lincoln would be bragging. Now, I imagine if I interviewed Napoleon Bonaparte, he would probably brag. Or somebody that took the name the Great, like Alexander the Great. I don't imagine if you call yourself Alexander the Great, you're too modest. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that every great leader is modest. And I have a view that if you are not modest, you can fake it. In other words, try to be modest. I think humility helps, But if you can't really be modest, then maybe you can fake it a bit, and maybe that'll be better than just being arrogant.
There's a master lesson right there. So this is a question that from Aldrich Crawley, who's done, and this will take you back a few years, David. She asks, which of your favorite 1 to 2 children's books depict good leadership lessons for elementary kids? So your favorite kids' books, from which you learned leadership.
Yes. Well, when I was little and I got my first library card at the age of 6, you could get that in Baltimore, and you were allowed to take out 12 books a week. And I would go and get 12 books a week and read them all in one day. And then I had to wait a week to take out more books. The books I was interested in then were not so much about great political leaders, but it was about great sports figures. So the ones I admired then, and was, for example, a book about Lou Gehrig, known as the Iron Horse, the incredible first baseman for the New York Yankees, or Babe Ruth, the great right fielder and pitcher for the New York Yankees. People who are sports heroes are ones I tended to admire a great deal in those days when I was 6, 7, and 8. In those days, I thought I might be a professional baseball player, but I quickly realized by 8, 9, and 10 that my athletic skills were de minimis.
But your reading skills were really, really good, right?
They were better than my athletic skills. You know, when you're 6 or 7, you have lots of dreams about how great you're going to be as an athlete. And then when you realize you're not quite as big as you thought you were going to be, you realize maybe you should pursue something else in life. So I got out of great athletic ambitions.
You did okay. You did all right. Now, Angela Braveboy has a question for you that I actually had for you. Why did you specifically choose Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg to be included in this book? And it's a wonderful section, and she says some very great things in it. But how did you choose her, and how was that interview?
Ruth Bader Ginsburg has been eulogized enormously over the last week, and deservedly so. And I won't add to all the great compliments she deservedly received. I would just give you my own interesting connections with her. As the chairman of the Kennedy Center for the last 10 years or so, I got a chance to know her because she would come to virtually every opera we would have. And when she was there, when I was making a speech from the stage, I would say, and by the way, today, Justice Ginsburg is here. And erupting would be a 20-minute standing ovation. When I would introduce presidents of the United States, you'd get maybe a 2-minute standing ovation. There was nobody I could introduce who ever get a 20-minute standing ovation. She was so popular. She was the rock star of the Kennedy Center. And I got to know her in many different other settings as well. But in that particular interview, which I did, it was done at the 92nd Street Y in New York. And it was, of course, sold out. And I think when you had her at the National Book Festival about 2 years ago, she drew the biggest crowd we've ever had. I think it was 9,000 or 10,000 people or something like that. And so she was an incredible person. And I found her to be very complicated to interview in some respects, because normally when you interview a person in today's age, if you ask a person a question, very quickly that person gives you an answer within, a millisecond. She actually, you can ask her a question and then she would sit there for like 10 or 15 seconds. You'd say, is she having a senior moment? Did she not hear me? Did I say something inappropriate? But no, she was actually doing a very unique thing. She was thinking. And she was actually thinking about what she wanted to say, as opposed to blurting out things like I'm doing now. I don't really think 10 seconds before I give the answer. I give it right away. But she actually was very thoughtful and gave really good answers. And I would say that, I've met a lot of impressive people in my life, and I've been fortunate. She's certainly one of the more impressive ones. And as you know, from seeing her, she weighed about 100 pounds. But my view is that 98 of those pounds were her brain.
Yes, absolutely. And her heart maybe too.
Right.
Yes. A wonderful, wonderful woman, wonderful model for us all. So Vinnie Tran has a question for you. Vinnie asks, do you have any advice for students, young people who aspire to be strong leaders?
Well, yes. The book I wrote is designed really for young people, because I have about 30 people who've become very good leaders around the world, around the United States, certainly. And I think if you read their story, you can see that there are many different lessons. I won't go through all of them, but one of them is failing, learning how to fail, picking yourself up, persistence, learning how to share the credit, learning how to communicate with other people, being ethical, being humble, as I mentioned earlier. But also one of the things I mentioned that I think all leaders really have is they keep learning. And how do you learn? You read. And you can learn by many different ways. And obviously, not everybody is a gigantic book reader. But it's my observation that people that read books have learned the ability to concentrate the mind. It's a lot harder to read a book than to read a newspaper article. It takes more focus. And if you have the focus, which is very important in leadership, to read a book, I think it's helpful. So the best thing I could tell young people now is realize that your best and most valuable muscle is your brain. You've got to exercise it every day. One of the best ways to exercise it is by reading, and reading books is probably much better than reading anything else. I don't imagine that William Shakespeare was just sitting there, tweeting all day or reading emails. I suspect he was reading and reading plays or reading books, and that's probably why he became the greatest writer in the English language.
Really good advice. Thank you. We all want to be Shakespeare, so we're going to take that advice. Hassan Ahmed asks you, with your busy schedule, and this is everybody wants to know, with your busy schedule, how do you make time to read, much less time to write?
Well, the secret is I actually have a twin brother, and so he does the private equity part, and I do the reading part. No, I've now reached the point in life where everything I do is something I want to do. I don't need to go make money. I don't need to prove myself in my business career. So I've done what I'm going to do largely in business, though I'm still involved in it. And so everything I'm doing, I enjoy doing. And so it's not a chore. So when I am reading books or when I'm interviewing people, it's fun. It's a pleasure. And as we all know, when you have fun, it's not complicated. It's something you look forward to. So if you like to play tennis, when you play tennis, it's fun for you. Well, interviewing people or reading books is something I enjoy. And I have the other advantage that, one, I don't play golf. And so that saves about 10 hours a day, because when you play golf, that's a very time consuming. I don't drink alcohol, so I'm not going to bars. So that saves some time. And, and so I also probably don't exercise enough, and that's probably saves time. I have the osmosis theory of exercising, which I have a lot of gym equipment, and I look at it a lot, and I hope that it'll rub off on me, but I don't exercise as much as I should. That's one of my big failings. I got to exercise more. But the truth is, I love what I'm doing, and when I'm reading books or I'm preparing for reading or I'm doing things like that, I'm doing things that I really, enjoy, and I'm reading books on things that I really know something about too. So to be honest, if I said, look, I'm going to learn how to be a physicist, or I'm going to learn how to be a chemist, and I had to start reading those books, I wouldn't get very far. I'd probably be on page 2 for about a year or so. So I'm reading things on subjects I know something about and really care about and enjoy.
Well, in that answer, I hear a lot of resonance with your very great care and championing of literacy in general. I mean, you have been a great champion of literacy. You give out a literacy award to which you collaborate with the Library of Congress to do. And so, yeah, you may not be using that your sitting bike or whatever it is in your basement, but you're doing a great deal for literacy, David.
Thank you for that. But let me mention something for people who are watching. Those of us that can read enjoy it, though I was thinking the other day, when I was in the first grade and learning to read, I couldn't pronounce a long word. And I kept saying to the teacher, can I be excused from pronouncing this word? It has too many syllables. And the word, as I recall it, was vegetable. And I couldn't quite get it out of my mouth. It had too many syllables. And so I think from that very, very beginning, I kind of said, I got to learn how to read. And I really enjoy it. But to be sad, it's sad that some people can't have that pleasure, because some people have dyslexia. And if you're dyslexic, it's a struggle to read. And obviously you can now mitigate that to some extent. But a bigger problem is illiteracy. And roughly 14% of adults in this country are functionally illiterate, which means they can't read past the 4th grade level. And if you can't read past the 4th grade level, your chance of being professionally successful, and therefore I think personally happy, is reduced a great deal. And so think about this: 80% of the people who are in federal in the juvenile delinquency system around the country are functionally illiterate, and 2/3 of people in our federal prison system are functionally illiterate. And so we have about 1.7 million people dropping out of high school every year, and many of them are functionally illiterate. So I love reading. I'm glad that I learned how to do it, but I really am sad that so many people don't know how to read. And I worry about something called illiteracy, which is to say that people can read but choose not to do so. And as you may have heard me say, Marie, 30% of the people who graduate from college every year never read another book in their life. They might read something, but they don't read books. And that's a sad situation.
Oh, it's a stunning situation. Absolutely. Here is since you worked for Jimmy Carter, President Carter at one time, here's a question for you on that. And our guest asks, Jimmy Carter had such care for the American people and was needed for a second term. In what areas was he let down and that caused him not to be reelected?
Well, I like to say that he thought he was going to promote me, and the voters heard that I was going to be promoted in the second term, and that was what caused his not being reelected. But if that's not the case, I think his problem was this. We had hostages for 1 year. And 1 year, it was every night we were reminded on TV that it was 1 year. And so that was difficult to overcome. Secondly, we had very high inflation. Inflation was 15% or something like that. And so that was very, very difficult. And we were in a very slow economic growth environment. We had gas lines. And Carter, had some, qualities that didn't rub people the right way. His accent was Southern. Some people didn't like the accent. And I think he was, for some people, maybe too religious in some respects. I'm not sure. But he got a bad rap in many ways. However, when history is written, people will say that the 40 years he has spent as a former president were extraordinarily well spent, and he did some terrific things as a former president. And it shows you that you don't have to be president of the United States in order to get something done. So the 4 years he was president, maybe he could have done things better, and I'm sure he would say he should have and could have done some things better. But I think he's reasonably content with what he's done, certainly over the last 40 years. And I think he was pretty content with what he was able to get done as president.
Well, we were talking about these two books that are coming out on President Carter. One is by Jonathan Alter, another one is by Kai Bird, and it's about time we actually did a reckoning on President Carter and his contributions and his time. So thank you.
When you think about it, the two books that are coming out are really the first two serious books written about him personally and his whole life. My former boss, Stuart Eisenstadt, wrote a terrific book on the Carter White House years, but that doesn't cover the whole of his life. And Doug Brinkley did write a book about his post-presidency, but there hasn't been as much Carter scholarship as there has been about many other people as president. And one of the problems that he has, and I think President Trump reflects this as well, to be considered a successful president in our country, you need to be you have to get reelected. I think President Trump really is determined to be reelected because it's a measure of success. And I think the same is true of George Herbert Walker Bush, very successful president, in my view, but wasn't reelected. And I think Jimmy Carter had the same problem. If you're not reelected, it's seen as a measure of not being successful.
Right. So here, going back to leadership, there are a couple of questions that I'm going to try to bundle together because they have much in common. And one question is, how has writing this particular book, How to Lead, influenced your own leadership style? And I would add to that American Story, too. I mean, how have writing these books about leadership actually influenced your own leadership style? And then a secondary question that attaches to that is, what leadership skills have served you best?
Well, it's hard to talk about yourself in that context without violating my rule that you should seem reasonably humble. So, if I say, here's all the great leadership skills I have, it doesn't sound like you're exactly humble. I would say that I'm not as successful as a leader as I would like to have been. And in the opening chapter of the book, I describe, my modest success in trying to be a leader when I was younger. I got lucky and later in life and got involved in a lot of nonprofit organizations where I became the chair and my business took off and did well. But I would say that the things that probably helped me the most were, one, the interest in being with other people, learning about other people, and just reading a lot, working hard, being willing to sublimate my ego to other people from time to time. But I would say I would be guided to some extent by parental, pressure. I would say not pressure, but my mother was always proud of what I achieved, and maybe that was part of the drive of it. Having your parents tell you that they're proud of what you've done is maybe something that motivates you. I would say that I'm very happy with the life I've lived, but I now realize, one thing that's very important to me, and that is my own mortality. So when you get to be my age, I'm now 71. That's an age that many people didn't expect to live to at the beginning of the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, the average life expectancy was 49. When Social Security was passed in 1933 and 34, the average life expectancy was then about 65. Now it's probably in the 80s, something like that. And if you get to be 71, it might be in the high 80s or something like that. But and if you get to be in your 70s, as anybody who's listening knows, and my mother always used to tell me, when you turn 50 years old, things deteriorate a little bit. The body, the mind, things aren't quite as good as they used to be before 50. When you hit 70, you realize that you spend a lot more time worrying about your body, and you go to more doctors and you take more pills than you did when you were 20 or 30.
Right.
So I've always thought that when you get to be 71, you probably have a reasonable chance of going another 10 or 15 years if you don't have a tragic accident or something like that. But now with COVID, you realize you could die in 2 weeks or 3 weeks if you get this disease. And so it's made people like me realize how precious life is, and how I need to make sure I accelerate what I'm trying to get done, because something bad can happen. So I have dusted off my bucket list. I'm working hard to kind of get things done that maybe I won't get to do if I wait too long. And I'm also trying to do what I call sprinting to the finish line, which is to say, keep going, don't slow down, and hopefully, live a long time. And then, I've signed a giving pledge, and my goal is to actually give away the bulk of my money before I die. And so I am in the process of doing that.
Well, you've been enormously generous, and your philanthropy has been a model philanthropy, as we all know. And I love that you talk about your mother, that she called you a yenta, and that
Yes.
you talk about her even giving you advice about aging, which is really, really wonderful. So here's a question from Karen Kennard that asks you, are there any common threads in the family structure, in the history of the CEOs that you've interviewed in this book? I mean,
Yeah.
can you make some generalizations about how they grew up and what their families were like?
As a general rule of thumb, the people who are in this book grew up in lower middle class families. Some were blue collar families. Some had only one parent. One parent had died, or another parent had left the family for whatever reason. You never get the case where somebody grew up in the Forbes 400 equivalent family, and that family was able to produce a great leader. Now, it might be the case that there are some exceptions, but generally, if you grow up in a fabulously wealthy family with all the money you need, all the privilege you need, it may not motivate you. And so in my case, my father worked at the post office, and he made about $7,000 or $9,000 a year, the equivalent of that, something like that. And I was their only child. We had a small, modest house, and no great luxuries or anything like that. But it gave you motivation, I think, to try to make something of yourself. And so my own children have probably had, a more complicated situation, because you grow up in a reasonably wealthy family, you may not have the motivation. Now, my children are motivated, and I'm proud of that. But it's a rare thing that you see children that grow up in very wealthy families be as motivated as I turned out to be because I came in a modest situation. In terms of my mother and father and the other parents of people like me that are described in the book, Warren Buffett said that the greatest thing that you can get from your parents is unconditional love. So if you get that, what else do you need? My parents, I was their only child, so they put a lot of energy into me. And interestingly, when my firm was growing and being successful, my mother would never call me up and say, David, you've made a lot of money today. Your company took something public. You sold something. You made a lot of profit. She wouldn't really care about that. When I started giving away money in reasonable amounts, she would call me every time she'd read about it, and she would say, hey, I'm really proud of what you've done, because you're giving away money. You're giving something back to society. And when she passed away a couple of years ago, and I went through all the scrapbooks that she had, the only scrapbooks that she really had about me were related to my philanthropic efforts and nothing related to my business efforts. So that's the things that she really cared about. And so I like to remind everybody who might be listening, I used to, when my father passed away, my mother lived another 5 years or so. I called my mother every single day, which was one of the great pleasures of my life, talking to her every day. I hadn't done that every day before. Maybe I just call her once or twice a week. And I would remind people that it's a lot easier to honor your parents and to communicate with them if you, do it very frequently. So it's a lot harder to honor your parents after they're gone. So all those who are listening, if you think you are honoring your parents, great, but you can always probably do more, and talking to them as frequently is probably a pretty good thing to do.
That's great. That's wonderful. Now, I have one last question for you, David. And this question is actually, it's from Erickson Young. And Erickson Young, first of all, thanks you for your service to the Smithsonian as chair for the Smithsonian Board of Regents. And he also asked a very pertinent question, and a great one to close on, which is, what is your plan for a new book? And is there a new book coming down the line in the future?
Yes, I'm working on a book that I hope to get to the publisher by the end of this year with any luck. It's called The American Experience, and it's about what is distinctively American. In other words, every country in the world has some things that people think in those countries are distinctively, let's say, Bulgarian or French or British, whatever, things about the culture of the country. And I'm trying to focus on what things have made America so distinctive and what are the things that make America so different. And I've done that through a number of interviews and some other things that I put in there, my own thoughts. And so that book will be coming out, I hope, in April or May next year, called The American Experience.
Well, we will really look forward to that, David. Thank you so much. And thank you in general. Thank you, David, for sharing your time with us so generously, and also your chairmanship of this festival, which we so deeply appreciate.
Thank you very much.